Yes, thank you very much, Professor Liming. I think it was, I'm a historian and here belonging to a minority. I am not a political scientist and not a lawyer and not a philosopher, so I shall speak from historical point of view. I think Professor Liming made an excellent presentation of how China is insisting now on the idea of sovereignty, which is not fundamentally traditional Chinese idea. China accepted the idea of political sovereignty and non-interference in domestic affairs as almost a religious belief. It is strongest and staunchest supporters of this idea now worldwide. But it is an irony of history, and allow me to just make a very brief exposition of how things changed in China. You know, China was one of the states which may be very interesting to think about parallels with current affairs, which had the idea of universalistic ideology, which can justify whatever interference, whatever affairs of whatever nation, because there was no nation. There was only one nation in the world. There was only one emperor, one legitimate ruler on the world. Only one sun on heaven, one ruler under earth. And theoretically, theory allowed and at times even dictated interference against immoral governments elsewhere. However, and Professor Liming is absolutely right, normally China was very reluctant to interfere. It did it sometimes. It did it under pretext of whatever humanitarian values. Just when Zheng He was making his tours, in the same time, the same emperor was annexing Vietnam under the pretext of domestic problems in Vietnam, which we must immediately resolve and make a humanitarian assistance to Vietnamese people, which of course resulted in an attempt of annexation. But China indeed was very reluctant to impose its values. Why? I think there are three explanations. First, Chinese ideology, traditional Chinese ideology, was much less missionary ideology than whatever you are used in this part of the world. China is certainly had nothing of common with Christianity, Islam, communism, or liberalism, of idea of imposing its values and saying that our values should be accepted by everybody. If you want to accept, very nice. If you don't want to accept, normally Chinese did not matter much about it. Second, China economically did not like interference very much outside the boundaries of China proper, because economically gaining territory, which was usually much less productive than territories of China proper, was a bad gamble. It was much better to extract more taxes from Chinese peasants than to try to conquer anybody abroad. And third, the Chinese political system was a system ruled by literati, who did not like very much wars, not because of morality, although they spoke about morality a lot, but because, you know, when there are a lot of wars, generals are very powerful domestically as well, and Chinese literati did not like very much too powerful generals. So China was very, it knew how to play with a moralizing universalistic discourse and the practice of particularism, and the weaker it was, the stronger was the impetus to practice particularism and to respect, really respect, integrity and sovereignty of other states. Now, however, when China was powerful, of course, there was no such limit. In the 19th century, as Professor Liming mentioned very briefly, China suffered an awful humiliation. And when it was humiliated, and it was a century of humiliation, from the mid-19th century to mid-20th century, everybody humiliated China in the most awful and most disgusting way in the human history, including imposing import of opium on China, you know, the Opium Wars. And China, which was very weak, adopted the idea of national sovereignty as an instrument of defending itself against the imposing Western powers. This idea, which Professor Liming so brilliantly exposed, China promoted the idea of peaceful coexistence with other states. Of course, it was very weak. And when you are weak, the idea of national sovereignty protects you against those who are powerful and who may impose their values or, of course, their economic interests under the pretext of universal values, like the universal value of the freedom of trade. Now, Under Mao Zedong, China had also this tension between universalism and particularism. It was committed on the one hand to the idea of universal revolution. It spoke very much about the, China was very frightening state. You maybe don't remember it, but in the late 50s, in the 60s, China spoke about the World War and about the global village encircling the global city and about the extermination of imperialists with the nuclear bombs, etc., etc. China spoke much harsher than Ahmadinejad was spoken when he was at power in Iran. But China did not do it. Actually did not do anything in terms of imposing world war. Why? Because, again, it was weak. And insofar as it was weak, adopting this particularistic idea of sovereignty was much better, a better gamble. However, now we enter a new stage. China is rising. It becomes more and more powerful. It is still not a global superpower, but it is surely a regional superpower. It has the ability to impose its will on immediate neighbors. Economic ability more than military ability, but economic and demographic ability. Don't forget that China is a huge state, incomparable in its size with any of its neighbors except India, which is not a real neighbor. It is beyond the Himalaya. However, in current world, China lacks what it had both in traditional China and under Mao Zedong. It lacks ideological self-confidence of whatever universalistic pretensions that in the name of which you can impose your will. China does not speak now in the name of any universal values. China doesn't know how to cope with a system in which values are imposed by actually its rivals. All these values which Professor Liming mentioned, democracy and human rights, are dictated by the hegemonic discourse which is defined by the American and to a smaller extent European universities, and to which China has nothing to contribute whatsoever from its domestic experience. So today China is the supporter of national sovereignty not because it is weak politically and economically and militarily, because it is weak ideologically. What is most interesting question, what will happen should China once be able to reshake its ideology and to propose itself not just as an economic superpower, but also as a kind of alternative to the Western values? Then I think the idea of sovereignty as a mantra of Chinese politicians may be a little bit modified. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Liming. Thank you very much, Professor Pines. And I have a question maybe directed to both of you. Given, on the one hand, the Western tradition, on the other hand, the Chinese, maybe even earlier tradition. And this is the concept that I've read about, but I think none of you has mentioned the concept of all under heaven, which is an sort of old Confucian idea about the role of the one state. And if you say that China is now weak in terms of ideology, I understand there is discussions occurring nowadays, if not in China, perhaps in the US among Chinese scholars of China, about the new or the potential new role of this concept of all under heaven. Is it a kind of trusteeship for humanity, a Chinese version of it?
Okay, actually I refer to it with...
in China we have a 中学为体，西学为用. I think this is the key point.
Yes, Professor Liming used the Chinese term that using the Chinese tradition as an essence and the Western tradition as a for utilitarian, the Western Lenin for utilitarian thing. So the essence should remain Chinese. Adaptation to Western values should be utilitarian. if I translate it from classical Chinese properly. You know, I actually refer to this without using the word all under heaven, because the fundamental idea, it was much before Confucius, actually. It was the idea that China is, there is no China. There is no China. There is only one world with only one legitimate emperor. It was a theory. But this theory was compromised almost from the beginning of Chinese empire. When China had to establish the protective wall against the Xiongnu, against its northern barbarians, it immediately said, okay, theoretically all the world should be unified. Practically, there is an area beyond which we shall not go, because it is economically unprofitable and socially, etc. So from the beginning, this idea was compromised. I think very much that those guys in US universities and in Chinese universities as well, who entertained the idea of Chinese Tianxia, of all under heaven, as a remedy for the maladies of Western political system, they are usually, I'm sorry, I hope I'm not offending, but they are almost usually coming from political scientists, from international relations, law, philosophers, not from historians, because when the historian looks at this idea, it never was really very much valid. It was a kind of, you could play with it, but practically you had always to recognize that the universality has its limit, and its limits are limits of power. If you cannot impose your values efficiently beyond your boundaries, then you need to compromise. So all this universality, which is very much entertained by current colleagues in China and elsewhere, if you look at a challenge to the idea of sovereignty, I'm afraid it will not come today from Chinese side, because simply it never worked. It was very nice ideologically. It worked only under the Mongols, who were powerful enough to come even to the Middle East, to Ain Jalut, and try to unify all under heaven, literally. But except of them, no serious ruler would fail to remember. It's a nice word, but not a reality.